Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by the Mac app, A Better File Rename 10. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know what? We got to talk about the Mac App Store today.
Do we?
We do. I want to dive right in. I know this is probably one of your all-time favorite topics.
Well, actually, when the Mac App Store launched, let aside the fact that I remember clearly it was a national holiday in Italy. So it was 2011, and back then I still used to work even on Christmas Day or other holidays.
Sure.
Because I was younger, I was hungry. I really wanted to make the website a success. And so I remember that everybody in my family was like having lunch together, or there was some kind of family gathering, and I was writing about the Mac App Store, which was really sad in hindsight. Of course I don't do that anymore, but I remember the Mac App Store launch very clearly because of that event, and also because I was really excited. I was a heavy Mac user. I used to do AppleScript and a lot of Mac stuff, and so I was excited by the idea of having an app store on my Mac. And then, of course, it didn't play out the way that I wanted it to.
No, it hasn't really worked out exactly the way everybody had hoped it would. And I think there's still a lot of good ideas there. I mean, the idea that you can get your apps from one trusted source and do all the updates from one place without having to manage a bunch of different licenses and deal with different payment schemes and all that, that's all really great. But it just hasn't really panned out the way that people thought it would.
And it's sad because we came back. I remember I did a couple of retrospectives about the Mac App Store, talking to developers a year after it launched, and then also in the following years, we did another article 5 years after the Mac App Store opened officially.
Right.
And the pain points by developers and the criticism has always been the same, always the same negative aspects, and Apple did not fix those original complaints. If anything, they just added problems on top of existing problems, which basically made the Mac App Store stay considerably behind the iOS App Store. Because over time, as the iOS App Store gained new features for developers and for users, and eventually last year, even this major redesign, the Mac App Store still stayed behind with an old design, no new features for developers, as we're going to talk about, and basically no visible changes for users.
Right. And one of the things for me that was really telling when I was putting together some of the show notes for this episode was one of the last things I did was I just did a general search on Mac Stories for Mac App Store. And the entire first page of results were stories about problems with the Mac App Store. Yes. I mean, including a couple of those retrospectives were in there. And I think it's fair to say, if you look back at those articles, a pretty significant portion of them were dedicated to going over some of those issues. And those are issues that, as you said, I mean, you can go all the way back to your 1-year anniversary piece in 2012. And those issues, some of those issues have been there since day one and just have never been cleaned up. But I thought what brought this to mind for me in recent weeks was that bug that surfaced, I think it was last week, where you can go into the system preferences on a Mac and basically put in any password in order to get into the Mac App Store preferences that are typically locked if you're not logged in as the admin user. And it's not like the worst bug compared to some of the ones we've seen recently, and it's being addressed in the latest beta, but it made me start thinking about the neglect of the Mac App Store. And it just really, at this point, it's hard not to see it as anything but neglect because these problems have been lingering for so long. But I thought one of the first things we should talk about is just the look and feel of it, the design of the Mac App Store.
Basically, there was, I think, one single small design refresh a few years ago to get rid of some of the drop shadows and 3D elements during the Yosemite transition.
I think so.
And that's about it, I think.
That's about it. It's like looking into a time machine, because it reminds me, it's what iTunes App Store looked like.
Yes.
Back in 2011 and 2012, because you have the grids of rectangles of new app. Well, not really new apps, but apps. We'll get to that. As well as all the other elements. And I have a couple screenshots that I threw in our notes, and one is of the store from 2014, and another one is from yesterday. and they look virtually
Wow.
identical.
Yeah, this is basically the same design, same sections, even in the sidebar.
Yeah.
Multiple years apart. I mean, one of them says OS 10 Mavericks at the top, the other says macOS High Sierra, but all the other sections are mostly the same,
Right.
which is incredible 4 years later. I mean, there's an argument here, I guess, whether the Mac App Store justifies and the ideal customer of the Mac App Store justifies the kind of weekly and now daily refresh that we see on the iOS App Store, because maybe you could argue that people on iOS are more inclined to download new apps and new games because it's just the nature of the platform, whereas on the Mac you buy something once and it's something that you use for work, even though that's of course an idea that I don't fully agree with, because people
Right.
also do work on iOS. But I guess the reasoning could be you just do not go to the Mac App Store to say, oh, let me see what's new today. I want to download a new game on my Mac. It's not like you're downloading the new Google Arts and Culture selfie app or the new free game from the top charts. You go there maybe every couple of months or every month, and you see what's new, and that's about it.
Yeah, I can see that. On the other hand, though, that's to some degree a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because
Yes.
if you let it stagnate, then there's no reason for people to go and look at it in the first place, and so they don't, and it just kind of spirals out of control from that.
Yeah.
I mean, I was surprised when I opened it yesterday, and I mostly open the Mac App Store to update apps that are already on my system. I don't really browse it very often. And when I looked and saw the rectangles of apps that were listed that were being featured, they're all really great apps, but they're not exactly new apps either. These aren't apps that, you go to the iOS App Store and there's stuff that was updated. Maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was a week ago, but it's really current. And these games and apps that are listed here, they're all great apps, but they haven't been updated in a while. Or if they have, it's been a very minor update.
Yeah, I mean, there's none of the new editorial and content from iOS 11 and the new structure of the iOS App Store is currently present on the Mac. This is the App Store before iOS 11, and the difference is so apparent now that on iOS you get this editorial approach to interviewing developers and telling stories around app culture and highlighting for example tips and tricks. For example, today on the App Store there's a tip on Fantastical 2 for iOS. So it shows how Apple is sort of embracing the idea that there's this rich ecosystem of apps for the iPhone and iPad. And then when you look on the Mac, it almost feels like it's this forgotten wasteland of old apps and games that are still around just because with no real effort to say, we know that there's also a vibrant community of Mac developers and we want to highlight them. None of that is currently on the Mac. And it's been this way for really since the beginning. But it's even worse now because you get this completely new and redesigned and more human, to an extent, App Store on iOS. And on the Mac, you still got the grid of icons and the same sections that have been in the sidebar for at least 5 years, which is just incredible.
Yeah, it really makes it stand out. It's a sore thumb now because now that you see what was done with iOS and what's possible, it makes it even more frustrating to go to the Mac App Store. Thanks to A Better File Rename 10 for sponsoring App Stories this week. Everyone works with files on their Mac. The Finder is good, but as the name suggests, A Better File Rename is, well, better. It's a Mac app that's incredibly powerful and simple to use. The app makes renaming files a snap, whether you want to add a custom prefix or suffix to file names, or add dates or something else. There are tons of different options. In fact, there are 15 different categories of name options to choose from that cover all the text, character, position, conversion, and truncation features that you could possibly imagine. One of the things I love best about A Better File Rename is that it takes the guesswork out of file naming. Apply as many of the name transformations as you like, and then preview the results right inside the app so you know exactly what you're going to get when you actually commit to the changes. The app supports a wide variety of tagging schemes too that help you keep things more organized than ever before. A better file rename is perfect for pro photographers for organizing projects. It can do things like extract EXIF data from files so that you can rename your files with something more descriptive than just IMG001, for example. There are similar features that help music lovers as well, because a better file rename can leverage ID3 tags to create a more descriptive name. There's a new preview pane too, so you can see the file's content and metadata at a glance. We've got a very special offer for App Stories listeners. Just use the code AppStories at checkout for 30% off a better file rename or any other app offered by its creator, Public Space. On top of that, there's a free trial, so take it for a spin and give it a try before you actually decide to buy. But don't wait too long, because this is a limited time offer. We'll have a link in the show notes. Renaming dozens or hundreds of files at once is not an easy task. Why make it harder? Get a better file rename to supercharge your workflow and reclaim the time you used to spend changing file names manually. Thanks again to A Better File Rename 10 for supporting the show. So the thing is, Federico, that it would be bad enough if all we were talking about is a design that's stagnated in an app that hasn't been updated to look current. But there have been bugs in the Mac App Store and in the app on the Mac for a very long time. And the situation's really only gotten worse over the years, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, very often you'll go and try to update an app or find an app, and it just fails. It just spins forever. Or, nothing loads, or it crashes, and it's always felt very slow and clunky to do any of the updates or anything else with the app.
Yeah, this happened to me many times, that either the Mac App Store just doesn't refresh or show me anything, which is a problem because I'm ready to spend money, I'm ready to give you money, and the store doesn't load. Or apps just keep spinning, whether I want to update them or I want to buy a new one. And I have wondered if maybe bundling system updates with apps in the same interface has maybe been a problem in terms of performance. Because, for example, on iOS, you do not get the iOS update within the update tab of the App Store, but on the Mac, you get system updates, you get security updates, and you get beta software updates from the Mac App Store. And I have asked myself whether this has maybe been a problem because it complicates things and it makes the entire thing slow and prone to these problems.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that, but I mean, the issue of the spinner is so bad that we had an article, I don't know, it was a year or two ago.
Oh, really?
TJ Lawoma about it, how to fix it.
Wow.
How to get past the spinner. Yeah, it's not great. The other thing that I've found that is really hard to deal with, and this is just because of the way I have my Apple IDs are set up, is that I have a separate Apple ID for buying stuff on the App Store. And for some reason, the Mac App Store likes to log me out. And because my email for both Apple IDs is very similar, if I don't notice, it defaults to my iCloud ID to log in on the store. And I've more than once logged in with the wrong Apple ID and then bought software. Fortunately, you can still use all that software. It doesn't make it unusable if you have two Apple IDs and download the software under each of them onto your Mac. But to get the updates, you have to kind of log in and log out
that
to
is
make
just
sure.
Terrible.
So every time there's certain apps that I use fairly frequently that I unfortunately bought under my iCloud email by mistake, and I have to log out of my main store ID, and it's just one of those things. It's kind of a bad user experience because first of all, it shouldn't log me out just randomly. And second of all, it should default to whatever I last used, I think, in terms of my login.
I remember from a couple of years ago, there was this problem with certificates that were expiring. And suddenly every app from the Mac App Store, that if you try to launch an app on your Mac that you previously bought from the Mac App Store, it would say invalid binary. And I don't remember how that was fixed, honestly. Maybe it just sort of happened that over the air, Apple made a fix. I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember precisely what they did either, but it had to do with certificates that had expired. And so a date passed and nobody was watching the Mac App Store and it broke. It was a strange bug because it didn't affect every single app, but it affected a lot of apps. And one of the ways to deal with it was to delete the app and start all over and re-download it. It's been circumstances like that and events like that that make you wonder if anybody's really watching the store sometimes.
I don't know if you've seen this recently, but it's been what I've noticed, and I've seen a couple of people on Twitter point this out, is a new trend of this type of scammy app. For example, app for Facebook, app for WhatsApp. This is what they call them, app for something.
Yeah.
And if you search the Mac App Store, there's a bunch of app for Microsoft Word or app for Gmail. In the best case, you're basically buying like a web view wrapped into some kind of native binary. But in other cases, these are actual like scams. And it's so surprising to me that this stuff can happen, especially on the Mac App Store, because I mean the Mac App Store doesn't get the same volume of new app submissions as the iOS App Store. And so I would imagine that if the Mac App Store gets, let's say in the most optimistic scenario, 500 new apps a day, which I highly doubt, but let's say 500 a day, I would imagine that there would be people at App Review that can spot these scammy products. But instead, search for something on the Mac App Store, see what you find. And it's, again, very, very sad state of affairs.
That's interesting. I've had some experience with the use of the word "for" in apps because having written an app that's for the iTunes affiliate program, App Review does look at that pretty carefully, and they're very careful to make sure that people use the word "for." But it sounds like these apps they maybe didn't look beyond the title and as to what the app was actually doing. One of the consequences, and we're going to get to some of the developer stuff in a second, but one of the consequences of the problems we're talking about, and one of the reasons it perpetuates itself and the store continues to stagnate, is that there are a lot of apps, a lot of Mac apps that are never brought to the store because either they can't for reasons we're about to talk about, or they just don't want to because for whatever reason, it's not a good business decision. I mean, having just done my favorite Mac apps of 2017 article about a month ago, I think of the 40 apps that I featured, I was surprised that more of them were on the App Store than not. I think there were about 25 of them or so that were actually on the App Store. But that's still a pretty good, almost half of them were not available on the App Store because from a technical standpoint, they couldn't be, or they had left the App Store, or they just decided that wasn't the best place to sell the software.
That's an interesting point because it shows one of the advantages of the Mac, which is also possibly a problem for the Mac App Store, in that Apple never removed the option to download and install software from trusted sources on the Mac. You can use Gatekeeper, for example, to make sure that you download software from the web that is, as a certificate from a trusted registered Apple developer. Or, of course, you can also remove Gatekeeper and install and run any software on your Mac. And so having this kind of backup option, this fallback, has allowed developers to say, I don't want to sell my product on the Mac App Store, or I want to leave the Mac App Store and I want to go back to the old way. But I wonder if not fully committing to the Mac App Store has been the reason why ultimately it just doesn't have the same impact and the same success of the iOS App Store, because if the Mac App Store feels like an option on the Mac, and some developers, a lot of developers embraced this option years ago, but today it feels like, personally, I don't use my Mac a lot, but it feels to me like when I need to buy a new Mac app, usually some kind of utility, I look on the website for the developer first. And if the app is available on the Mac App Store, sometimes I go like, yeah, sure, I'll go to the Mac App Store and I'll buy it there. But if I get the feeling that I'm about to purchase the kind of app that could easily be removed from the Mac App Store for some reason, either because it's an app with some kind of advanced functionality or an app that does automation or scripting, basically not the menu bar utility that lets you convert currencies,
right?
But any kind of more advanced application, I don't fully trust the Mac App Store because I don't know if it'll be around for a long time, and I don't know if my purchase will count 3 years from now, whereas it feels safer to buy from the developer's website and I do this all the time, look in my email inbox for some serial number from 2 years ago,
right,
and it still works. Whereas maybe in those 2 years, the app that I bought is no longer on the Mac App Store and my purchase doesn't count anymore.
Yeah, having been burned by that a couple of times myself, I'd go through the same thought process. I think about the app and is this the kind of app where I see features going that might butt up against what's allowed in the Mac App Store? And if so, I buy it on the website because I don't want to be in the situation where I bought it on the Mac App Store and then somehow I have to do some sort of complicated migration to the website version, or I just have to buy it again. It becomes a hassle at that point. I think one of the problems that we should probably talk about right off the bat is sandboxing, because if you remember when sandboxing was instituted, it was not when the Mac App Store came out, or it was the rules were tightened after the Mac App Store opened. So that was what I think drove some initial developers away from the Mac App Store. Apps that need system-wide file access, like SuperDuper, for instance, or BBEdit, they couldn't really survive in their current form on the Mac App Store.
Right, because basically sandboxing is effectively a technology, is a macOS technology that prevents apps from just doing anything they want on the system. It's based on this set of entitlements, basically roles or capabilities that apps need to declare and say, hey, I'm an app that I want to be able to edit text files in your downloads folder. And or I want to modify system volume, or I want to access your Wi-Fi network and stuff like that. And when sandboxing was announced by Apple, there was a lot of criticism and pushback by the developer community. And I remember that sandboxing, the date after which Apple will require sandboxing on new Mac apps on the App Store, the date was delayed about at least a couple of times because really they couldn't figure out how to work with developers. And ultimately, sandboxing was enforced and it's still in place on the Mac App Store. And I am convinced that the way that it's been designed and the fact that apps, as I mentioned, with more advanced functionality or backup utilities, stuff like BBEdit, for example, very, very complex and very advanced and powerful application that wants to go beyond clicking on a document to open it or displaying something in the menu bar, those apps cannot technically be possible on the Mac App Store. And that's a problem because it basically has turned the Mac App Store into a watered-down version of what you can find on the web if you want to download and use powerful software on your Mac.
Yeah, it tends to be more for, I mean, there are obviously exceptions, but it tends to be more for single-purpose utilities, things that do one thing well, but maybe don't permeate your entire system. And one thing that I've thought for a long time I'd like to see Apple do to fix the situation is to have just a different level of review for those apps. Those apps are inherently more dangerous, I guess, because SuperDuper is going in and accessing every single file on your disk, right? But the volume is lower, and it seems to me if you had a specialized team of people, you could get through some of those apps and offer some of these more complex apps. I mean, there are more complex apps on the Mac App Store, but a lot of them are Apple's apps, which sandboxing doesn't apply to. You know, things like Logic and I guess Final Cut and those kind of apps.
Yeah. But what about test flight? Can you, I honestly, I'm not sure. Can you do test flight betas on the Mac?
No, you can't.
Not. Okay.
No, you can't. You can't.
Awesome.
You can't do test flight. A couple other things. These, I mean, we're deep into the iOS 8 era features that were added to iOS, right?
Oh yeah, totally. 3 years ago.
So, test flight, bundles, and analytics. Those are all things that the Mac App Store does not have, and they were all introduced on iOS with iOS 8. And that's one of the things that really bugs me more than anything else is to think that, all right, not only do Mac developers not have things that were introduced with iOS 8, but they don't have the store that was revamped with iOS 11 either. We're several generations of refresh behind here now from iOS, which is too bad. They don't have bundles at all on the Mac, but what I'd really like to see are bundles across platforms, right? Why shouldn't there be a bundle for Ulysses on the Mac and iOS, for instance, or Bear or whatever?
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing.
But they do have subscriptions, so that's something. Yeah,
they do have that, and they have responses to reviews.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So how would you like the Mac App Store to change? If you were in charge, what's the first thing you would do to the Mac App Store?
I think I would burn the current Mac App Store to
All
the
right.
ground.
All right,
I think
that's a strategy.
I think I would get rid of it and I would combine it with iOS. I don't get why they're separate, and I think there's a hesitancy to cause confusion between versions of apps and things for what platform they're on. But let's face it, on the iOS App Store, we've already got some of that confusion, and it's being handled to varying degrees of success. So we've got iMessage apps, we've got Apple TV apps, we've got iPhone only, iPad only, universal apps. We've got quite a few different options on iOS already. I say just throw the Mac apps in there too. And, Apple IDs, if you ever go into settings, you can see all of your devices that are set up with that Apple ID. And if someone doesn't have a Mac that's set up with their Apple ID, maybe you could just hide those apps so they're not even visible. But what I'd really like, and we talked about it when we talked about iTunes, is I'd like to have some kind of web store.
Yeah, I agree. It would be perfect to just go on the web from any browser and say, I want to buy this and download it on my computer or my iPhone or my iPad or my TV, whatever.
Right.
But honestly, I don't think Apple is ever going to do a web store, just because I don't see them thinking that a web store is a priority, because their reasoning, I assume, is if you have an iPhone, you go to the App Store. If you have an iPad, you go to the App Store. If you have a Mac, you go to the Mac App Store, or you go to the developer's website. So I would love a web store, but I think that Apple doesn't care about it. But the idea that you bring up of combining iOS and Mac apps under the same store is interesting if you consider the rumor of this new initiative that Apple might announce or might not announce at WWDC in 6 months, of having some kind of unified framework between iOS and the Mac, so the developers can combine or use some of the technologies from iOS on the Mac, or have some kind of shared interface between them, which is interesting, because I wonder if, maybe a couple of years from now, we'll have a store where you open a page for an app like, say, Ulysses, and you get 3 icons for stuff like runs on iPhone, runs on iPad, runs on Mac. And that could be interesting.
Yeah.
Could have a lot of ramifications from a business perspective, because does it mean that you buy something once and it runs everywhere? Or does it mean that it's the same app, but it's still separate purchases? So that's a question that if Apple is going to do this, it'll have to answer for developers.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions that came out of that Gurman article in Bloomberg. And we talked a little bit about it with James Thompson last week. And it isn't clear. And I do feel like it's going to be a multi-pronged story. There'll be developer tools, potentially. I think it makes a lot of sense to unify more of the underlying code. But this very well could be also a business combination type of program as well, where, as you said, there are apps that are offered either as individual purchases, or maybe universal binaries combine all the way across. We've already got it with iPhone and iPad. Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll add the Mac as well.
I'm going to build on your idea, and I'm going to say that the apps should be under one single app store. And Apple is never going to do what I have in mind. But I would love if the Mac App Store became something more like Steam for macOS. Basically, a game store is what I want. I think the Mac App Store, if Apple cared about gaming on the Mac, I could imagine some kind of new initiative by the company to say, we want to make sure that people don't have to install Windows or to build PCs if they want to play the latest PC games with, powerful graphics and the latest APIs, for example, stuff like VR. Or if I want to play something like, I don't know, what's a popular PC game? John, you're building a PC. PUBG. So let's say I want to play PUBG and I don't have a PC. Why do I have to build a PC? This should be on the Mac. Again, this is never going to happen. But I would love to see the Mac App Store rebranded as a game store, so that people like me, that I don't want to touch a Windows ever again in my life. I'm honest. I just don't like it. I need to do Windows maintenance every every couple of years for my relatives with their PCs, and it's just plain awful, just plain awful. But I could see the Mac App Store sort of playing to the strengths of, when you go to the front page of the Mac App Store, you see a lot of games. There's quite a lot of games ported from Windows. It's just a problem of convincing developers that the Mac is a serious gaming platform, which is, also the type of games that you get on iOS and that you get on the Mac are really different. So the separation of apps live with iOS apps in a single app store and games are separate on the Mac game store, whatever, that would make sense. But then again, this is just basically a utopian vision that I have for what the Mac App Store could be. Honestly, I think the most reasonable explanation is that the Mac App Store will be slowly deprecated and we'll have a single app store where you can go in and find iOS and Mac apps and games. This is just my vision of basically Steam made by Apple. That's what I want, but it's never going to happen. Unless, and this is something that I've just listened to on the latest episode of Kotaku Split Screen, is the video game podcast. It's an excellent podcast if you like video games. Yeah, I really like it. I'm a fan. And I think Jason Schreier said that one of his predictions for 2018 is that Valve is going to be acquired. And they do this prediction show every year. It's super fun. But I asked myself as I was listening to the show, what if Apple bought Valve and they had Steam?
That's never going to happen, Federico.
I know it's never going to happen, but basically all of this stems from my jealousy for all the people that I see with huge Steam libraries, a lot of video games on PCs, and I'm like, I also want to have a Steam library, but I don't want to use Steam on the Mac. I as in its current state.
You don't want to use that app either. That is not a nice
I don't want to use the app. I don't want to use Windows. I want Apple to make Steam. So
yes, their own version of Steam. That would look. There's a lot that Apple could learn from the gaming industry. I think. I mean, even Sony has figured out how to allow somebody to buy a game on the web and have it download to their PS4. So that sort of thing. There's a lot of things like that they could adopt, even if they aren't creating their own sort of game store. But I have to say I'm not super optimistic about the Mac App Store. I feel like having just gone through this big iOS redesign of that App Store, it's still too soon. I just feel like that was a lot to bite off, and it's hard to see refocusing on the Mac App Store to make it anything like the iOS version. That's why I kind of feel like maybe the easier path just is to scrap it and throw everything in with the iOS apps.
I have to agree. Honestly, I don't see Apple at this point. They're so behind the iOS App Store. It just wouldn't make sense to jump on stage and say, hey, we're rebooting the Mac App Store. Who's going to believe you after all these years with a store that is stuck before the days of iOS 8? We're talking 2014 here. It's 4 years later. And I don't believe that developers are going to give Apple the benefit of doubt again with the Mac App Store. So why not say, we're keeping the Mac App Store around, we're giving you a transition period, we're announcing some new features for Gatekeeper, we are redesigning the entire sandboxing engine, and also we are going to launch a single App Store where people, if you want to, they can buy iOS and Mac apps. Honestly, I think that should probably be what Apple does. Or they could listen to my crazy idea and make Steam for macOS. But, that's just me.
Just because I don't think you're going to get it, Federico, doesn't mean I don't agree that I'd like to have it too.
This is not why. This is not why I'm not a Mac OS executive. It's because I would make terrible decisions.
That's probably true. All right, Federico. Well, I think that's good for this week. Thanks again to our sponsor, A Better File Rename 10 for the Mac. And we'll be back next week with another episode of App Stories. You can check out the show notes at appstories.net. And as always, you can find us both at macstories.net and at Club Mac Stories. Federico is at Vitici on Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.